The Vestal virgins were priestesses of the Roman deity Vesta, the goddess of the hair. There were some serious punishments for failing in one's duties, like beatings, being buried alive, or having molten lead poured down one's throat.
In most cases, in the typical traditional Roman family, Roman women were closely identified with their perceived role in society, especially their role in caring for the family as the main nurturer. In particular, giving birth to legitimate children, a consequence which would be bestowed onto them as soon as they begin menstruating. Typically before the age of 18, they would be married very early as a way of insurance for their future husband, as she would be pure and untouched by any other man. The Roman family was male-dominated and typically headed by a senior male figure like the father or the grandfather. Women were always acted in subordination as it was reflected in their naming practices. Males had 3 names, while all women in the same family were referred to using the feminine version of the family name. A married woman could keep her maiden name or just be referred to by using her husband's name, which is a tradition that is commonly used today in today's society. As a lot of women today, when marrying, tend to take their partner's last name, turns out that in other religions and cultures, that's not always the case, which proves it was a Roman tradition that passed down worldwide. When it came to legal rights, there hasn't been enough research on the societal discrepancies of a woman's right in Roman culture. However, unlike ancient Egypt, Rome did not regard women as equal to men before the law. They received only a basic education, if any at all. They were subject to the authority of a man. Traditionally, this was their father before marriage. At that point, authority switched to their husband, who also had the legal rights over their children. However, by the 1st century AD, women had much more freedom to manage their own businesses and financial affairs, unless she had married in manu, or in other words, in her husband's control, which conferred the bride and all of her property onto the groom and his family. Women could own, inherit, and dispose of property. Traditionally, these women who had married sine manu, meaning she was without her husband, control was still under the control of her paterfamilias, had being obliged to keep a guardian or a tutela until they had died. By the time of Augustus, if a woman has 3 children or a freed woman with 4, they could become legally independent as a status known as sui iuris. When it came to work, it depended on the woman. In reality, the degree of freedom a woman enjoyed depended largely on her wealth and social status. A few women ran their own businesses, as one woman was a lamp maker or had careers as midwives, hairdressers, or doctors, but these were pretty rare. On the other hand, female slaves were common and filled a huge variety of roles, from lady maids to farm workers and even gladiators. When we think of ancient Roman gladiators, we tend to stereotype and think of them as just men warriors or slaves, but interestingly enough, female slaves were also forced into the pit to fight alongside their male counterparts, or as Emperor Domitian preferred, to pit them against dwarves or his particular entertainment. Women fought in gladiator fights for 200 years until Emperor Septimus Severus banned their participation from these bloodthirsty games. Women who chose a life in the arena, as it does not seem that it was a choice, may have been motivated by a desire for independence, a chance at fame, and financial rewards including remission of debt. Although it seems a woman gave up any claim of respectability as soon as she entered the arena, there is some evidence to suggest the female gladiators were honored as highly as their male counterparts. The brave, strong Roman gladiators not only had their strength to put them in the pit, but also their swords. The type of armor and weapons they fought with depended on their social ranking as a gladiator. Wealthy widows, as a subject to no man's authority, were independent as well. Other wealthy women chose to become priestess, of which is the most important were the Vestal virgins. They had a lot of influence, but not the choice to construct decisions in a form of politics within law. Wealthy as some of them were, because they could not vote or stand for office, women had no formal role in the public life. In reality, wives or close relatives of prominent men could have political influence behind the scenes and exert real, albeit informal power. In public though, women were expected to play their traditional role in the household. They were responsible for spinning and weaving yarn and making clothes, as these are usually typically made from wool and linen, although wealthy women, those whose servant made the clothes, were often dressed in expensive imported fabrics like Chinese silk or Indian cotton. Women were expected to be the dignified wife and the good mother, and while all these rules could be bent, they couldn't be broken. As an example, Julia was the daughter of Emperor Augustus and was renowned as a clever, vivacious woman with a sharp tongue. However, Augustus was traditional and insisted that Julia spin and weave like a plebeian woman to demonstrate her wifely virtues. This was unfortunate because wifely virtues was not her strength. In fact, Julia had a series of lovers and many people knew this. Augustus, who was socially very conservative, was furious, and so he denounced her in public and banished her for the rest of her life. There were limits even for the emperor's daughter. One of the earliest influential female role models in the Roman Republic was Cornelia, daughter of famed Roman general Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. Well educated and raised in the house of a military political leader, she emerged as an intelligent presence in Roman society during her marriage and as a young widow. She spurned offers of marriage, including one from the Egyptian pharaoh Ptolemy VIII, instead of devoting herself to raising raising her 3 surviving children, when her 2 sons, the Gracchi brothers, whom she called her jewels, later embarked the populist reforms where she backed them staunchly into public, while guiding and sometimes chiding them into her letters. May Jupiter not for the single instant allow you to continue these actions nor permit such madness to come into your mind, which she wrote to her younger son Gaius Sempronius Gassius. Both sons were assassinated though by a conservative Roman faction, but Cornelia retained widespread awe and respect both for her learning and her devotion to family and state. The influence of these women were only going so far, as the Paterfamilias had the right to decide whether to keep newborn babies. After birth, the midwife placed babies on the ground only if the Paterfamilias picked it up as the baby formally accepted into the family. If the decision went the other way, the baby was exposed as deliberately abandoned outside, and this usually happened to deformed babies, or when the family, or when the father, did not think the family could support another child. Babies were exposed into specific areas and places, and it was assumed that an abandoned baby would be picked up and taken as a slave. Even babies accepted into the household of Paterfamilias had a rocky start in life. Around 25% of babies in the 1st century AD did not survive their first year, and up to half of all children would die before the age of 10. When it came to unions, there were specific laws governing marriage. A proper Roman marriage would not take place unless the bride and groom were Roman citizens or had been granted special permission called the concubinum. At one point in the Roman history, freed slaves had been forbidden to marry citizens. This restriction was relaxed by Emperor Augustus, who passed a reform in 18 BC called the Lex Julius, so that the 1st century freed slaves were only prohibited from marrying senators. Augustus insisted on the restriction of marriage, as citizens were not allowed to marry adult workers or actresses, and provincial officials were not allowed to marry the local woman. Soldiers were only allowed to marry in certain circumstances, and marriages to close relatives were forbidden. Finally, unfaithful wives divorced their husbands could also not remarry. While ancient Roman society was dominated by men, the pantheon of Roman gods were not. Of the 3 supreme deities worshipped by ancient Romans, only one, Jupiter, the king of the gods, were male. The other 2 were Juno, chief goddesses and protectress of the empire, and Minerva, Jupiter's daughter and the goddess of wisdom and war. Roman divorce was just as simple as marriage. Just as marriage was of a declaration of intent to live together, divorce was just a declaration of a couple intent not to live together. All that the law required was that they declared their wish to divorce before 7 witnesses. Because marriages could be ended so easily, divorce was actually pretty common, particularly in the upper class. When she filed for divorce, a wife could expect to receive her dowry back in full and would then return to patria potestas, a protection of her father. If she had been independent before her wedding, she would also regain her independence upon divorce. Under the Lex Julia, a wife found guilty of adultery in a special court might sacrifice the return of half of her dowry. However, the law did not recognize adultery by husbands. After all, Roman society was very much a man's world. And finally, the Vestal virgins lived in the temple of Vestia in Rome. Vestia was the native Roman goddess of the fireplace, and the 6 virgins tended to the sacred fire, baked in sacred salt cakes, aka mola salsa, and oversaw the care of the sacred objects in the temple. Young girls from some of the Romans' best families were chosen to be virgins by the Pontifex Maximus. Starting between the ages of 6 and 10, they had to reserve 30 years, but most continued to help out even after they had left. The priestess' religious significance gave them unusual power and influence, and they occasionally used it as when they intervened to save young Caesar from the dictator Sulla. They were also expected to remain virgins and face severe penalty if it was discovered that they lost their chastity. They would also be buried alive, which when it comes to history was a very intense time. And speaking of history, that's all for today. Be sure to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. My name is Jess, and I wish you all the best. Bye!